Hello, everyone. We hope that you can all see and hear us. My name is Owen O'Shea. I am a lawyer and a partner in the firm of CMS Cameron McKenna Nabarro Oldswang. I serve as the head of the white collar practice in that firm. I shall be chairing today's panel, which I've been looking forward to for some time. The title is Desperate People Do Desperate Things at Desperate Times. And that is, I suppose, something of a truism, but it's the sort of thing that is very often forgotten when shortly before bad things start happening within organizations, after major frauds or other types of ethical or financial scandals are uncovered. People close to those, or perhaps supervising those responsible, declare themselves shocked in the manner of Captain Renault in Casablanca, that such things could have happened. The purpose of our discussion today, broadly speaking, is to discuss ways of trying to mitigate or even prevent these kinds of behaviors. And we have the benefit of a very distinguished panel of speakers who I will introduce en masse, and each of whom is then going to raise certain points with us in order. So our first speaker is Tom Caulfield. Tom dedicated over 38 years of his professional career to public service in the United States, all of which was in federal law enforcement. He retired from those roles in 2015 and co-founded an international anti-corruption consulting firm named Procurement Integrity Consulting Services. Their clients include impressive names such as the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Law Institute, and various government and anti-corruption authorities in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the United Kingdom. In the US, his company has worked with both government and private entities in reviewing procurement policy compliance, enhancing ethics and compliance programs, building effective whistleblower procedures, and establishing procurement anti-fraud protocols. That's Tom. Our next speaker will be Adam Hanover. Adam is a managing director with CohnReznick's Restructuring and Dispute Resolution Services practice. He provides financial advisory and litigation support service in the areas of investigative and financial forensic accounting, accounting malpractice, damage analysis, business valuations, bankruptcy-related matters, and mergers and acquisitions. He also provides clients with assistance in resolving contractual disputes relating to working capital adjustments. That's Adam, whom we're delighted to have with us. David Alexander is our next speaker. David is the head of forensic services at Smith & Williamson, the very well-known professional services firm. He leads the fraud and financial crime practice. He has over 25 years experience as a forensic accountant and a fraud investigator. He acts for both claimants and defendants in civil, criminal, and regulatory matters involving allegations of fraud, bribery, and corruption. He's a chartered accountant and a Regent Emeritus of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. That's David. And then finally, but not least by any means, is Matthew Denny. Matthew is an investment manager and has the title of Head of Origination at LCM, which is a publicly listed global litigation funder. Matthew has been in funding for over 5 years, and before that, he was a partner at Enyo Law, one of the UK's largest and most respected litigation-only firms, and was also a director of Navigant, a global disputes consultancy. So I'm sure you'd agree with me that we couldn't have asked for a better panel. I'm going to turn over now first to Tom, who is going to speak to you for a short while. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Owen. I always hate those introductions because it makes me sound old, 40 years. Let's start off. It's interesting because we're going to talk about desperate people doing desperate things in desperate times. I'd say that's a pretty accurate statement. And as Owen mentioned, I don't think too many people would debate that. statement, except I'm going to take it upon myself to modify it slightly because I think it's more aligned with our conversation to say, especially in my part of the talk, is here's this question. What level of disparity is needed in a person's life to cause them to do desperate actions like corruption or fraud? And the reason why I want to talk about that is because I'm going to talk a little about the mindset of a fraudster themselves. And I'm going to theme that around a thing called the fraud triangle. You know, the fraud triangle for people like myself in the anti-corruption world has been around for decades. And it kind of, in a very simplistic way, explains what is needed for a person to commit corruption or fraud, or realistically, for people to commit things of inappropriate actions. Okay, and I think that'll fit perfect into our conversation, and our distinguished speakers after will get more into more of the rudimentary processes that can be compromised. The fraud triangle really falls under the principle of what we call a three-legged stool. And what I mean by that is it requires three things to exist in order for, in theory, corruption and fraud to occur. And those threes are pressure, perceived opportunity, and rationalization. And I'm going to talk about each one of those and link it to what we're talking about. The first one is pressure. Now, according to the fraud triangle, what this pressure really comes down to is what motivates the crime in the first place. The individual has what they believe is an unshareable financial problem or responsibility. It doesn't solve through the legitimate means, meaning that they feel compelled that they have to commit this illegal act to solve their problem. I say unshareable, and the reason why is because if you really look at some of the root causes or some of the history of some of these major fraud cases or corruption, there was other opportunities for them to settle or resolve their financial problem. But they believe in their mind that it's something they can't share. You know, some of the more common pressures that employees may face or that individuals is living beyond their means. You know, that's a very common red flag, okay? Somebody who's driving that Mercedes and then buys another one most frequently. High bills or personal debt. Somehow they by living beyond their means, they achieve this high personal debt. Personal financial losses. Somehow they invested in something that wasn't within a good investment, they lost money. Really a big one is substance abuse or addiction. In the business world, sometimes it's need to meet earnings to sustain investors' confidence, or the need to meet productivity targets. You know, one of the things we commonly do when we do assessments is we did an appreciation of the environment, what they call the control environment of which people are operating. And we try and sense what's more important, meeting your deadlines or making ethical integrity decisions according to the management. So these are all examples of the type of pressure that a person could feel when it comes to making that decision. Now I got to tell you, the pressure we all live through, we all have, okay? Unless we're financially independent. The fact of the matter is we all have this certain amount of pressure. So the pressure is not the single unifying driver to cause a person to commit a fraud or corrupt act. Another thing that they have to have is a perceived opportunity, a belief that they can commit the act, and the belief that they won't get detected or caught, okay? And that's critical. I got to tell you right now, for those that are in the profession like myself and our distinguished speakers, we are very aware of the fact that one of the strongest internal controls, one of the strongest anti-corruption controls is a perception of being detected. Even if it's not accurate, the fact of the matter is when people believe they're going to get caught, it increases the probability that they will not do the particular event, okay? So this perceived opportunity, you know, these are poor internal controls, poor training, poor supervision, the lack of prosecution of perspective. I do a lot of work in certain parts of Africa, in certain countries in Africa. There's this perception that you won't get prosecuted at a certain level. These are all things that can cause a person to believe that they can get away with it and therefore attempt to do this particular act. The last one is rationalization. I can tell you right now, while I was with the government, I was a professional interrogator. I have listened to people rationalize crimes from doing terrible, thoughtful things to children in the belief that they're helping a child to mature, all the way up to people that are doing terrible things to another human, causing their death. So rationalization is a phenomenal thing that people do. But again, that rationalization is the belief that everybody does it. We have always done it this way. It was the only way that I could get my financial burden off of me. I had no idea that it was against the rules. So there's all this rationalization. And for those that are professional interrogators, I can tell you, a person can come up with unbelievable rationalization that you and I may go, oh, that is just ludicrous to think that that was appropriate. People will come up and rationalize it. And I can tell you, crime after crime, time after time, people that I have interviewed, because we don't interrogate anymore, we interview subjects, they're always got a reason. And we use that self-imposed rationalization to better explain why they did what they did so that they admit to the events of the kind. So I kind of wanted to start this off, and I asked these other individuals if it'd be okay if I kicked it off, because I wanted to start you off with understanding the psychology of it. So let me close out by telling you that a person with over 40 years of doing this business, I can tell you right now, both globally and domestically, the fraud triangle is a concept that actually does work. That same fraud concept is what we use in the interviewing world, but also we use it in the concept of trying to identify controls and how your controls are in place. So because perceived opportunities and equal controls is so critical, let me end with this, okay? There's some really good documents out there, especially in the COVID aspect, that I like to kind of point you to, that you may want to go if you want to do more research as it relates to how internal controls could be weakened and corruption affiliated with COVID. One is the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes G20 report. It's called Good Practices on Combating Corruption in the Response to COVID-19. You can go to UNODC's website and you can find that report very easily. I think it's a really good one to familiarize yourself what the world had done and how they suffered in the world of COVID. I'm a procurement guy, anti-corruption related, so I really focused on that one. So at this time, I think I've taken up my time. I wanted to set the stage for understanding the mindset of a fraudster. Don't underestimate that rationalization, but always keep in mind that the strongest internal control is that perceived opportunities. So again, thank you for your time. And Owen, I'll turn it back to you.
Tom, that was awesome. Thanks so much. That was really great. I'm going to move things along to Adam. Adam, please take over. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody out there in TV land. We're going to learn a little history today. So George Santana, who is a Spanish philosopher, stated that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. With regard to fraud, analyzing prior economic downturns can provide insight into what we should expect from the current economic crisis. There are really two primary lessons to be learned. First, economic crises and recessions reveal frauds that have been hidden by good times. As Warren Buffett has stated, you only find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. Booms help fraudsters paper over cracks in their account, from fictitious investment returns to exaggerated sales. Many of the big book cooking scandals of the past 20 years emerged during downturns. In the early years of this century, the dot-com crash exposed the accounting sins and frauds at WorldCom and Enron. Those frauds germinated during the go-go years of the late 1990s. Both firms went bust soon after. As we may recall, Bernie Madoff's fraud wasn't detected by government investigators. Rather, it was revealed by the onslaught of the Great Recession. The market meltdown sent clients clamoring to withdraw funds from his business, and because of his fraud, He simply didn't have the cash resources to satisfy his clients' needs. Second, besides exposing previously existing frauds, recessions give rise to brand new ones. Recessions and economic downturns fuel the growth of financial frauds. Indeed, if there was such a thing as a law on frauds, it would be that frauds blossom during economic recessions. Now, we could learn a thing or two by analyzing the US government's response to the Great Recession, the last recession that we had. The US government had allocated approximately $700 billion to restore economic growth. Most of it was for TARP, which was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, wherein the government purchased illiquid troubled assets from financial institutions. The goal was to stabilize their balance sheets and to restore economic order. The TARP legislation also created a special inspector general who was charged with monitoring fraud, waste, and abuse in connection with TARP. Needless to say, TARP was littered with fraud. After all, dispersing hundreds of billions of dollars in short order fueled fraud, and it fueled a lot of it. While TARP fraud came in different flavors, many of them arose from companies keeping false books and records, making false security filings, and simply lying to regulators. As we shall see shortly, this was not at all a one-time event. The Special Inspector General for TARP concluded that inadequate oversight left the program susceptible to fraud. Hundreds have been convicted of TARP fraud, including bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy crimes in connection with TARP. Ultimately, investigations have led to the direct recovery of over $11 billion. But unfortunately, history is repeating itself once again. In March 2020, the US passed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which is also known as the CARES Act, a mammoth $2 trillion economic stimulus program. It was 5 times the amount of the TARP program. The program had different tranches, and one of the most popular programs was called the Paycheck Protection Program, wherein companies could apply for loans with basically a one-page application. The PPP loans, as they were called, were in large part based upon a company's historical payroll costs. Unfortunately, funds were dispersed with little or no due diligence regarding the accuracy of the applications. Perhaps we should question why the program oversight was not more robust given the fraud that arose during the TARP program. After all, what would George Santana have to say about history repeating itself? In any event, the PPP loan process became ripe with fraud. For example, fraudsters submitted applications for shell companies, or they filed applications for operating companies, but those companies vastly overstated the number of their actual employees, which vastly increased the amount of their fraudulent loans. Again, the US government established a special office to monitor fraud, waste, and abuse. 1 year after the program was established, the government has already charged over 400 individuals with criminal offenses based on fraud schemes. To date, they've recovered approximately $1 billion, but the recovery process is ongoing and it still has a ways to go. In short, and in sum, we've learned that recessions reveal pre-existing frauds and that they enhance the growth of brand new frauds. In addition, we've learned once again that dispersing lots of dollars in short order with minimal oversight is a toxic recipe for fraud. With that said, I pass the baton back over to Owen.
Hey, Owen, this is Tom. I don't want to deflect you, but I was for 7 months, I was with the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery. History's not only going to repeat itself, but it's going to actually get even worse.
I mean, it's fascinating. The numbers are fascinating, right? Because we saw with TARP, it was it's a fifth of the size, am I right? Something like that
That's
of
correct.
CARES. So, I mean, it's not unreasonable to expect 5 times the amount of fraud, cheating, and misfeasance and so on.
Yes.
Would you agree?
I would. Just one, I've kind of taken a sledgehammer to my government, but there's one public policy issue that we need to look at, and I'll mention this briefly. You could either have a program that disperses funds quickly and tries to address the problem quickly, or you could have a problem that you could have a program that disperses the funds slowly with lots of due diligence, but you run the risk of not fixing the underlying problem. So there's a balancing effort that had to take place here, and obviously the government chose fast and loose as opposed to quick and quick with lots of due diligence. Obviously, that's made by politicians who have a lot of different moving parts that they have to deal with. But I'm just here to advise that the choice that they've made creates a gaping hole for continued fraud.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks both for that. On to David, if you would.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks to Nexia for inviting me to speak at this event. What I wanted to do was to build on probably particularly some of the concepts which Tom touched on, and I suspect underline some of the issues raised by Adam, but from a UK perspective. So I want to talk about 2 concepts, and then I've got a case study of an actual investigation that we've done as a result of the pandemic, and see what lessons we can draw from that. So the first concept or topic I wanted to talk about was acceleration or accelerating change caused by the pandemic. Again, picking up on one of the topics that Tom picked on, we know that change can create opportunity. And I don't think that we've seen fundamental changes in the way that people do business or the way people commit fraud, but I think we have seen an acceleration of processes and movements, perhaps even accelerating events by what would have taken 5 years in cascading into a year. I think an example of that is agile working. I think that you know, we were all getting used to working from home and working outside the office, and we're doing that maybe to a lesser or more extent on an ad hoc basis. But the pandemic has accelerated that change. And certainly my experience is, you know, when I go back to the office, it will not be anywhere near full time, and a good proportion of my time will be either working from home or working from other places. And from a fraud perspective, that change obviously creates opportunity. Another example is of where accelerated change has occurred because of the pandemic is the idea of paperless offices and the getting rid of paper and files and documents and going into the cloud. I mean, again, that was something that was well on track. It was there was a well-defined roadmap for that pre-pandemic. But I think our experience over the last year, 18 months has really accelerated that. And that again creates opportunity for fraudsters. And then finally in this area, and this really comes out of the concepts of agile working and not physically getting together with your fellow employees, is the idea of alienation. And you know, when we talk about the fraud triangle, we talk about motives, opportunities, and rationalizations. A lot of that can be challenged by, you know, the fact that team working and, you know, seeing your fellow workers every day and really getting to know and understand the people you work with. And I think alienation as a concept, and you know, as a way of separating people, again, is a strong driver to fraud, because when people are trying to rationalize their behavior, there's there's less reasons to stick them to the organization, or to stick them to their fellow employees. The second concept, which really flows out of that, is the idea of our controls now fit for purpose. So if we've seen an acceleration of change, and I take the example of moving from an office-based environment to a working from home environment, then do the controls in an organization take account of that? Are they fit for purpose? And we know what normally happens in these situations is when you bring in a new work regime, or you bring in just a new way of working, then controls usually follow on behind, or they lag behind until someone points out some of the weaknesses. And I think there's a real risk here in this, as we accelerate change, is that controls won't be fit for purpose. Again, you know, flowing through from the idea of alienation, open plan offices are a great place to really get to know and understand what other people in your organization are up to. And you take that away, and that is a lack of control. It comes with a lack of supervision, lack of supervisory controls. It's far harder to see and understand what your subordinates or what your bosses are up to if you're literally miles away. And as I speak to you today, I'm probably nearer the east coast of America than I am London, as I sit here in Devon. But you know, the idea that people are remote and sometimes hard to get hold of is going to increase the risk. We're no longer seeing original documents. You know, I remember in the early days as a fraud investigator, one of the tests I was taught to do was to look at, for example, purchase invoices and see if they had been folded. And if they had been folded and creased, it was a good chance that they'd been through the mail, and that therefore that added to the legitimacy of the document. You know, documents that looked like they literally were pristine and literally just come off the printer could have really just come off the printer. So you can, you know, from an investigations point of view, you can pick up from the look a lot from the look and feel of documents. I mean, we've been going digital for years. I mean, I've always said that maybe 80% is probably more of the evidence that I look at in an investigation is digital. I honestly can't remember the last time that I had to search somebody's office and rifle through somebody's filing cabinets looking for smoking guns and key documents. But the acceleration of change that COVID has brought, the pandemic has brought, and the lack of documentation, it will increase the risk and will increase opportunities for fraudsters. And really any control where, because you know the organization is smaller, and again we would have seen this during the recessions in the past, where you've got an individual who's controlling the assets, is recording the transactions to do with the asset, and is responsible for any reconciliation exercise, will break down segregation as duties and will create opportunities for individuals. My recommendation here on these issues is to focus on the basic controls. Is to focus on things like the bank reconciliations, the suspense account reconciliations, and particularly to follow up on customer and supplier complaints. 3 examples of really basic controls which can, well, both prevent and detect fraud. Finally, I just wanted to go through a case study. We've been involved recently with an investigation that involved a joint venture, a franchise relationship between 2 joint venture partners, where the franchisee was responsible for running a number of restaurants. The underlying motive for this fraud was a need for cash by the joint venture partner to support his lifestyle. I don't think that lifestyle was anything illegal. I don't think we're talking about gambling or drugs or anything like that. But he had a very high lifestyle, and he needed to pay for that. And the accelerating effect of the downturn on the trading of the company caused by the pandemic also brought this issue to light. So it was actually highlighted when the franchisee was pushing the franchisor to pay a dividend for last year's trading. The franchisor was reluctant to pay that dividend because it was using the coronavirus job creation scheme to support staff. Now, in the UK, approximately 9.5 million people are currently on furlough and are supported by this coronavirus scheme. And estimates of the costs range up to 50 billion sterling that will be paid in these grants. Now, there's no rules or regulations or guidance about paying dividends if you have employees on furlough, but there has been a lot of press and a lot of bad press from companies who have relied on the government's furlough scheme and yet are still paying dividends to directors, to shareholders. So it's not surprising that in this case, the franchisor didn't want to pay the dividends. The cash squeeze as a result of this really brought out a £1 million hole in the joint venture accounts. Half of that was invoices that the franchisee had put through the joint venture, which related to his other businesses, and the other half related to unpresented checks. Now you've got to remember, this is a cash business. This is a restaurant, and when the franchisor was first asked about what these £500,000 of unpresented checks were, he came up with various stories and excuses, and one of them was, well, it was where people were doing group bookings at the restaurant, and because they were large bookings, people were paying with checks. Still an unbelievable story, but this was a story that they were giving to the auditors, and the auditors were willing to countenance or to accept some of those explanations, pending further evidence. And the thing was dragging on longer and longer, and eventually the client lost patience and pulled us in as forensic accountants to do the investigation. In reality, what the franchisee was doing was he was removing cash from the business. So he was going around the various restaurants and literally taking cash out the tills to support his lifestyle, and in effect, through the books and records, replacing that with unpresented personal checks. Although clearly those unpresented checks did not exist at the time. I'll just leave you with an addendum on that. Apparently, and I wish I'd been in the room at the time, when the auditors understandably asked to see this £500,000 of unpresented checks, the franchisee held up a brown paper bag and shook it and said, well, here they are. Here are the unpresented checks. And the follow-up question from the auditors, well, can we see them? To which the reply was, well, we'll let you see 3 of them. And I never really understood why the franchisee thought that maybe it was on the basis that auditors do sampling when they do their audit work. But he was never ultimately able to substantiate that these unpresented checks were real. This the investigation helped crystallize the black hole in the accounts of £1 million, and has ultimately, unfortunately, ended up in the franchisee and the franchisor parting company. That fraud would not have been detected so soon had it not been for the acceleration of the lack of cash and the poor trading activity that was brought about as a result of coronavirus and the pandemic. Happy to hand back now.
Super. Thanks very much, David. Very interesting case study, and I think it's sort of in microcosm the sort of thing that lots of us are going to be seeing. We're going to move on now to Matthew. So Matthew, please carry on.
Thank you very much, Owen, and also thank you, Tom, David, and Adam, for your presentations earlier. I also say, Tom, that I'm slightly worried by the flag of living beyond means and my ability to rationalise some of the purchases I've done over the last few years. So I'm slightly worried for myself there. But I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, obviously, from after the event, looking at the applications that we've received, the cases that we've funded, and the topic is desperate people do things in desperate times. But I would argue that greedy, innovative people do some very interesting things in very good times, and it's only the desperate times that brings these out to light, which is exactly what Adam and David have just said. And what we're seeing is the liquidity issues in numerous sectors are bringing massive issues to light that have been going on for years. And I'm sure there will be an awful lot of opportunity that the current position or current situation we find ourselves in will allow, and there will be many more frauds and many more insolvencies. But that will take a fair bit of time to come through, and talking to people in the market, we're not at that position yet that we are seeing, as people would call it, the tsunami of insolvency or fraud litigation from the issues relating to the pandemic. We're still running the furlough scheme, and until that stops, I don't think anyone actually knows where we are. And as I said, that will take an awful lot of time for that to unravel. But the amount of fraud applications we see, or cases relating to fraud, I should say, is getting larger and larger. And that is because businesses are running out of money. They're running out of excuses. They're running out of ways of hiding what was going on. And they are having to go into the insolvency process. And once that happens, things begin to come to light. So I think from our point of view, the desperate times is much more about the ability to look under the bonnet and understand what has gone on. The biggest challenge, though, is where is the money? And obviously, I don't want to spoil my talk in 45 minutes, but the predication of fraud is that you take the money and you hide it, or you spend it and you enjoy it. The difficulty for investors, for creditors, is how do you get that back? And again, the desperate times we find ourselves in for a lot of businesses relating to liquidity, that has a massive knock-on effect to those people who have been defrauded, whether that's investors, creditors, businesses, because there isn't the money to bring back into the business. And that's one of the biggest challenges, and one of the biggest reasons why an awful lot of this, from a litigation point of view, is not undertaken, because there isn't the money in the estate, there isn't the money in the business, and there isn't the money from external sources, because you're not likely to get anything out of it. And I think the other aspect of that we're seeing is businesses who are tight for liquidity, they are slightly worried about their position, also their counterparty's position, because if they have a potential dispute along a supply chain, whether that's industry, construction, whatever it may be, if they don't start bringing their potential litigation or their claims against the counterparties soon, there's an argument that they could become insolvent and other people will get there first. So I think the other aspect of this is if you're not at the front of the queue, you may not get anything out of it at all. So, you know, I don't want to sort of be all doom and gloom about the position of fraud from a funding and external capital point of view. But the rationale is important. We need to understand that the fraud was taking place, the MO was there. We need to understand what was going on. But at the end of the day, if there isn't the money there, it's a very difficult thing for us to undertake. But as I said, the number of applications we're seeing within the fraud arena, whether that's pension schemes, investment schemes, tax schemes, it never ceases to surprise me what people will come up with. And I also think that the more, how shall I say, colourful schemes were a lot easier to sell, as it were, in the good times, where everybody was washed with money and thought, you know, it was that good, and it was true. No surprise. Simple reality is, if it looks too good to be true, it often is. So I think from my point of view, the current pandemic, the desperate position we find ourselves in, the outcomes of that won't be seen for a few years to come. We are funding still cases relating to MTIC fraud, which go back to 2007, 2008. So there is a long tail from this position. But I think my point that I started with is the one I'll end in with, which is desperate people do things in desperate times, but there's far more going on in good times that now just become uncovered in the current situation we find ourselves in.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll chip in with a quick question here, just from my perspective. I mean, are you seeing, or is it of interest to you, what happens where the state gets involved in investigating fraud cases? So something that does seem to be happening more is the use of asset freezing and account freezing powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act, for example, by various government agencies. And I know there's some similar things going on in the US. Is that something where you think that there's going to be, your side of the house is going to see more of these things or become involved in some way? I mean, I appreciate the claimant there is the government who doesn't need funding, but nevertheless, there are going to be follow-on lawsuits coming out of these kinds of actions.
No, absolutely. Whilst the government doesn't need funding, I think that the reality is that there are so many potential issues of further fraud, and I don't think they've got the time and the wherewithal to track everything down at once. And I think the longer they leave it and focus on what they know is a good claim with recoverability prospects, there will be others that won't be followed up on. So I think they don't need funding, but they should use it. And the biggest problem is if they don't use it, they don't get to potentially pursue all of the routes to recovery. But if they do use it, they've then potentially got to be accountable for why they used external capital. And I think there's an element of damned if you do, damned if you don't. We are still seen in the funding market as vulture capital almost. And I think there is a general position within the press, within the general market, that why should an external source of capital be making any return on what should be taxpayers' money? And there isn't the understanding that, well, without external capital, you're not going to get all of that recovery. And I think that's the biggest issue for doing anything with the state. As much as I'd love to be involved, and I've talked to various IPs about packaging things up on a portfolio basis, offering a drawn, undrawn interest rate facility, the biggest challenge will always be, we don't need it, thank you very much. And even if we did, we didn't want to be accountable for it. But yeah, my personal view is they should be doing as much as they can at the earliest possible stages. Otherwise, there's never, ever going to be any chance of recovering that money.
Binary thinking is the curse of the criminal justice system in all kinds of ways. Okay, I'm been told by the magic of technology that we've got quite a few questions coming from the audience. So I'm going to take the opportunity now to go through these, and I'll I'll put them up in order of the order that the speakers first spoke, as it were. So the first question is going to be initially for Tom, and then I'll invite people to chip in. So the question is, and I'll read this: our close Nexia network should help us to coordinate work in making recoveries for clients, along with our lawyer and other friends. How does the team think we can provide the best support for this? So supporting the coordination through the Nexia network, how is that best done, do you think? I'll start, Tom, with you, but others can raise their hands, and please do.
Thank you. But before I answer that, I just want to play off Matthew's statement, and it's a very accurate one as it relates to, we're talking about desperate times, but the amount of fraud that's occurring in good times is just phenomenal. And everybody in this panel has witnessed it probably more times than we wanted to. And it never shocks to amaze me how people, especially public officials, will just basically jeopardize their entire retirement on a small dollar event from that perspective. And the only other thing that I'd like to play into is, and I won't speak for the rest of the speakers, but please do not misunderstand me. In no way is desperate times a way of justifying what can be perceived as a de minimis fraud or theft or corruption. It just so happens that we're talking about the impact of desperate times. Be cautious. For those that are in the listening audience who are involved with assessing internal controls or listen to self-imposed rationalization or justification, that de minimis level has not changed because we're in a distressful time because of COVID. A business that is corrupt, even at the de minimis level, is still a corrupt business. Okay. And Owen, as it relates to the question, it reminds me of the debate or the challenges continuously going on at the United Nations level, international, is how do we work more together? How do we cooperate? How do we share information from financial recoveries all the way to investigations? And the forum is a perfect opportunity to do that. Like so many forums, as common folks and common thoughts and common professions come together under a forum like this, or the association, it's an opportunity to share, not just through education, but also the abilities to help each other, understanding the laws of the local areas, but also the current situation that we're dealing with. So
Sure.
Any partnership, it's finding that connection. And I can tell you, and I'll close out with this, don't underestimate the word of connection, because connection brings trust, trust brings openness. And that's so important when you have this type of sharing of information, not in a form like this, but when you try and share about investigations. I know Adam, I know Matthew, I know David. And so I'm more comfortable in saying more about my investigation, my inquiry, because of my trust and relationship. And that's probably one of the things I always like to remind people. That trusted relationship is what allows you to share openly, freely, in confidence.
Great, here. I'll move to the next question because we do have quite a few. So it's as follows. We have seen both organized crime and the Chancellor making money from the huge amounts made available, as you've mentioned. Is it the panel's view that the best recoveries will come from the Chancellor, i.e. the one-off fraudsters who aren't, organized criminals necessarily, aren't in this as a business, as it were, but to take their opportunities as they come along? Adam, do you want to lead us on that one?
Sure. I think at least here in the U.S., the government is trying to use whatever tools it has in its toolkit to try to snag as many people as they possibly can. I don't think they're going after one-offs, but they are clearly going after patterns of fraudulent behavior. And there are clear patterns that we see, at least to date, here in the US. For example, as I mentioned, with regard to this PPP program, there are, it really is unseemly, the number of people that have filed loans with fictitious companies. And you would arguably, people would say, well, who cares if they filed for a fictitious company? But that's not what's happening. They're filing for dozens of fictitious companies, dozens and dozens and dozens. And it's not a single person doing that, but a lot of people who are doing that. And when you see these patterns of behavior that are repeated by individuals that are casting a lot of toxic fish in the sea, the governments are using these wide nets to kind of snag them all.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this? I mean, it's I frequently say that government agencies charged with investigating and prosecuting crime have the toughest job, because the difference between the people they investigate and the average criminal is about 50 IQ points and quite a lot of pre-planning about how to avoid detection. So the prosecution of organized crime is always that bit more difficult, as we all know. But
Owen,
yeah, go ahead, David.
Jump in here. I think, well, picking up on one of the themes that Matt said, is you've got to follow the money. You've got to go after the organized criminals, because there's there's a bigger, by definition, there's a bigger pot of money there, or there's a larger theft, and there's more chance of recovery. I mean, the problem with the chances and these smaller frauds is that quite frankly, the cost of investigation could quickly exceed the value of the individual frauds.
Right.
You've got to think about the economics of it.
Oh, if I can,
Sure.
play into that. Well, first, the very first fraud on the PPP program happens in 24 hours after the program was released. And the two people that did it, who are currently under an indictment in Florida, worked off of an existing shell company that they already had in place an artificial identity. So there is that. But probably to play into what David was referring to, I can tell you from what I saw within the federal government, data analytics and data searching that's happening is phenomenal. The coordination that is happening, at least at the law enforcement level in the Department of Justice in the US, I've never seen in my entire almost 4 decades. Everybody is working under a unified goal to get as many of the fraudster as they can to try and keep away from what Adam demonstrated, and that is the large volume of fraud that occurred under the previous one. And data analytics is playing such an amazing part of that and identifying great leads and opportunities to go after fraudsters.
Sorry, if I could just add to that one. I think picking up on David's point, if you had a large collection of chances against which you could basically spend the capital, whether it's from an external source or state's own, you probably got more chance of collecting overall, because some of those chances won't be sophisticated enough to hide it. So I think if you go after an individual chancer, whether or not that's a funding proposal or a self-funded one, the likelihood of you getting anything back net of what you spent is minimal. So I completely agree with David, but actually if you lump together hundreds, thousands of individual chances, your ability to recover across that particular portfolio, for want of a better word, is considerably greater. So I think that there is a real opportunity for chances, but you have to do it all at once, which is why I think, you know, the states, as in various states, not the US state, need to do what they can much sooner rather than later.
Great. I'm conscious of time. I don't think we'll be able to get through all the questions that have come through, but I thought there was a good one that everyone can give a rapid answer to, which is this. Do you think that fraud generally is far, far more prevalent than we believe, and COVID has simply shown this up? Do you think that most of the time people get away with it in normal circumstances? So I guess the question is, are we seeing, is there more fraud prevalent in normal life, which COVID is exposing, or is COVID the trigger for a greater level of fraud? So I'll start, I think, with David on that, and I know that we'll all keep our answers to the point because we've got literally 60 seconds left.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. It's got to be a yes or no answer. I mean, COVID and a recession that might follow as a result of it will reveal existing fraud, but it'll also create the motivating factor for more people to commit fraud. So it's going to be yes on both fronts, I'm afraid.
Matthew?
I agree entirely. Wherever there are changes, there's opportunity, and with the liquidity issues and the pandemic and the furlough schemes and the insolvencies, it's just going to highlight what's happened. So it's an unequivocal agreement to David, which is it's yes to both. It's not one or the other.
Yeah. Tom?
I'll agree with my panelists. It's yes to both. There's more fraud out there than we're well aware of as it relates prior to COVID, and COVID has created the opportunities and people to rationalize and justify their action and believe in that they're entitled to it. So yes to both.
Adam, are you going to be the contrarian? Are you going to say fraud is actually hardly ever happens and that COVID is just bringing it?
Unlikely, not unless there's an invasion of the body snatchers. I'm in total agreement with the panelists. As I think I demonstrated, recessions reveal pre-existing frauds and then they fuel brand new frauds. It's just the fuel that stirs the engine, and that engine is booming right now.
Right, right. If I'm not kicked out, I'm going to see if I can stretch to one more question. Do we think? I mean, do we think that insolvencies and frauds are going to, what do we think is going to happen? Are they going to uptake in the next 2 years, or are we looking at a 5, 6, 7 year time period? David, what do you think? Are you seeing more insolvencies in your line of work with the fraud background, and you think that's going to keep on, is going to go through for a 4 or 5 year period?
Well, I think in the UK, the furlough scheme is still protecting a lot of companies, both for good reason and both hiding fraud. And I think it'll be until, certainly in the UK, it'll be sort of September time that we start to see it. But I always think the fascinating thing is, like, all investigations are in retrospect, and it's fascinating. You might be investigating something now that happened 5 years ago, and I can bet you bottom dollar that there's frauds going on at the moment that we will be investigating in 5 years' time, because everyone on this panel whose career stretches 25, 30 years has seen that before, and there's no reason to think it will change.
Right, right. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Thank you to everyone. There literally were quite a few more interesting questions in the comments. What I might suggest that the organizers do is circulate these to the panel, and people can, in due course, consider them and maybe respond. But it's been a great feedback from so many of our audience members. I understand that we are due to wrap at 14:35. It's now 14:37. So unless I'm told differently, I think we need to wrap it up there. But thank you so much to all of the panelists. I think it's been a fascinating discussion.
Right. Thanks, Owen.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks all.